Hey yo guys, what's going on with everyone out there? So, I decided to make a video mainly because I looked through my closet and boy do I have some excess stuff that I should probably be selling, and I think some of it's kind of interesting. More so the fact that we all know how MMA so exploded and everyone's a big UFC fan now, but a lot of you people don't know what it was like watching the UFC from the very early days. So that's why I have 10 VHS tapes from the UFC under the SEG days for sale, and some of them are really interesting shows, and I guess have a lot of importance to how the UFC as a whole, got started, and the success of them. I mean, these are when they were actually doing really incredible buy rates on pay-per-view at the time. Some of them were just outstanding. So we'll just take a look at them here, and I guess I'll tell you a little bit about why I like the show and stuff of that nature. Just to let everyone know, these tapes all play; they're all 100% good to go, so you don't have to worry about that. Now, granted, they are VHS, but still, I mean, if you're a collector of stuff like that, I guess it's kind of more interesting to own the actual content that was released by Trimark Video. And with these tapes, you will get some interesting movie trailers for what Trimark was releasing. As some of them are just the worst pieces of film ever released, but the shows that the UFC stuff they were releasing was much better. So the first one we have for sale is, of course, UFC 1. Of course, everyone knows this one took place at the McNichols Arena in Denver, Colorado. The show where it was all about, jiu-jitsu versus boxing versus sumo versus any basic form of martial art. Basically, if you were a martial art fan, it was your wet dream come true. This show is, of course, has a couple of interesting fights on it. The first one for me would be the first fight in the history of the UFC in Gerard Gordeau versus Tala Tooley, where Tooley, of course, makes the big charge and then gets kicked right in the face, and all his teeth go flying and stuff of that nature. But I think the thing we should most note is interesting is Bob Superfoot Wallace is the commentator here, and when he introduces everyone to the show, it's instead of saying the Ultimate Fighting Championship, he calls it the Ultimate Fighting Challenge, which, if you've read the book by Jonathan Snowden, Total MMA, everyone at SEG was freaking out that they just, first of all, he botched that, and then he burped. Now, the burp isn't on here. It's on if you could ever find a actual VHS recording of the live pay-per-view event, you'll see that, but not on the tape. But you get some, the commentary is just such an interesting thing. I swear to God, it's like an 8-man booth. The star of a commentary is actually NFL Hall of Famer Jim Brown. He just being the only guy who actually gives a damn about what goes on in the octagon at the time, and just like looking at the octagon back then was just really something of interesting compared to what it is now. It's just like the padding was foam, and just very interesting stuff. But like I said, there's some interesting fights on here. Like I said, the Tala Tooley Gerard Gordeau. You get Ken Shamrock versus Pat Smith. Ken Shamrock versus Royce Gracie, which is a legendary fight. A lot of people would say. And it's basically just the coming out party of Royce Gracie and Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, and basically just setting up that, it's not about punching that can, win a fight. You can win a fight on the ground, and it's not power, it's more finesse that can help you win a fight, which is basically what has exploded in the world of today. And, like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu gyms are opened around, North America now because of this show. It's a very interesting show. I think you need to go watch it. Honestly, one of my favorite parts is the fight between Kevin Rozier and Zane Frazier, where Zane Frazier is the first and only man to ever lose a fight in the UFC as a result of getting stomped to death. He got curbed the fuck stomped to death. So really interesting. You check the back out. So a good show. It's honestly something you need to, I think, see if you're, a fan of MMA and UFC. If you haven't seen it, just look at it now and compare it with what's going on today in the world of MMA. So there's that show. Next up would be UFC 2. It took place from the McNichols Arena in Denver as well. This show actually did a higher buy rate than the first one. I forget what the first one's buy rate actually is, but this one like was up by like 5% from the first one, which is just amazing and just showed that this thing actually took off without really any like way to build it. They just had to like throw some commercials on, and that was about it. You would just have to know about it word of mouth. So there's that. This one has a couple. The fights are pretty interesting. It's basically it's a very short show. Keep that in mind because it's probably the shortest show you're ever gonna see. You can honestly watch this in 20 minutes, in half an hour. Honestly, I think that's how long it took me to watch this one. But yeah, so it's basically just Royce Gracie running through the tournament and getting in there against Pat Smith. But the fight that I think is the most interesting one on this show is it's either Pat Smith and Scott Morris, because first of all, Scott Morris's discipline was ninjutsu. He was a ninja, which is amazing. I hope someone comes back one day as that's my discipline, ninjutsu. But it would have to be Orlando Veet and Remco Pardue, where Pardue is a big guy with, I believe he was, I forget what style he was, but he gets Pardue, who's a kickboxer, or excuse me, Orlando Veet, who's a French kickboxer, down and just elbows him to death. So there's that. It's, not a lot of people remember this show. The show, to me, is also more remembered in an interesting fact that Big John McCarthy, this is his very first show where he refs basically everything. And, basically everything from UFC 2 to today. So that's a pretty interesting fact. Next up, we have UFC 3, which features the first great fight in the history of the Ultimate Fighting Championships in Royce Gracie versus Chemo. Because it was basically like, oh, how long is it going to take till Royce Gracie wins another UFC? But Chemo was a very, very interesting man in this. He was one of the first fighters to come out with, kind of a pro wrestling style aura with the cross. He had a bit of a hype man with him as well in Joe Son. And, he went out there and actually was a guy that wasn't afraid of Royce and actually took it to Royce and battered and bruised Royce. Like Royce had a black eye, broken ribs. While, Chemo just got cut up and stuff like that. So this is an interesting show, and it's really that. The whole point of UFC 3 was so that we could get Ken Shamrock versus Royce Gracie, the rematch. And that never happened because Shamrock in his opening round fight got hurt. I forget his name at the time. But then, of course, the Chemo Gracie fight, and that canceled each other out. So, the fight's over. So the finals of UFC 3. Now, first of all, when they say Royce Gracie can't continue, Chemo comes out and does basically a pro wrestling thing with Joe Son, and they just like run into the cage and just go, yeah, yeah, it's just great. The finals of UFC 3, ladies and gentlemen, it's definitely a trivia fact that you will own. It's Harold Howard, who now is in prison in Niagara for, I believe, attempted robbery or something like that, or he did something with involving a weapon. And Steve Jenham. Yes, Steve Jenham, ladies and gentlemen, will go on to win UFC 3. The most interesting fight on this show, however, is Keith Hackney versus Emmanuel Yarbrough, who's a 600-pound sumo who knocks Hackney outside the octagon at one point, delivers nasty, and then eventually, Hackney rocks him, delivers nasty elbows to his head, punches, just an amazing thing. Hackney, of course, I believe Hackney gets eliminated from the tournament by breaking his hand on Yarbrough's head. Just an incredible sight to see. So definitely a show I think a lot of people need to see. It's the third show, and it's a really impressive feat. Next up, we have UFC 4, which gets the very first super fight, because the UFC and SEG, they were all like, oh my god, we have to realize that there are fights we want to see, but because of this tournament style, we may not get them because of injury, like we just had at UFC 3, so they've made Ken Shamrock versus Royce Gracie as a fight, and had a tournament with a guy who was basically gonna, win this thing. It's the debut of Dan Severn. This is UFC 5, actually, I should say. So you get the debut of Dan Severn, or the return of Dan Severn. Dan Severn at UFC 4 made his debut and just was amazing. I have that tape. It's not for sale, but look it up. Just look up the fight between Dan Severn and Anthony the Mad Dog Macias. Just if you thought what what's his name, Rory McDonald did to Nate Diaz at UFC 129 was amazing in terms of German suplex. Just look at that fight, people. That's amazing. So you get this one with the super fight between Shamrock and Gracie, and you get Dan Severn basically running through a tournament and being freaking amazing. The super fights, I have to say, were not the most entertaining things out there, but they're part of history, and they're basically just, you know, the UFC stepping away from the tournament element of the shows, and you get that. Plus, if you're a wrestling fan, you get to see Dan Severn win the UFC belt while rocking the NWA Heavyweight Championship. Pretty impressive stuff. And Dennis Carluzza, who is an NWA promoter out there, just being a total mark for himself. Awesome stuff. Then we get UFC 6, which is the debut of Tank Abbott. This is also, I believe, the debut of another guy that doesn't get the credit he deserves, but was a pretty interesting style guy in Paul Varlins. Paul the Polar Bear Varlins, who was just a guy that would like to go out and scrap, would get maybe past the first round of the tournaments, but always go down in the second to someone who actually had a lot of skill. I believe this is also the show that had the debut of the bad boy from the streets in Marcos Hujas. I believe, I'm not 100% sure. I know for sure Tank Abbott debuted on this one. And, of course, it's basically UFC 6 is the story of Tank's life. You know, he goes out there and has an amazing KO. His first fight ever, he has an amazing KO. Knocks out John Matua, and it looks like he's dead, by the way. John Matua is dead. But, you know, gets in there, and he gets into the finals against Oleg Tektarov, but then loses. So that's basically it. This is a really interesting show in its own right, and I also think this show has maybe one of the best front kicks I've ever seen from Pat Smith. Like, he throws a front kick and the man, like, flies outside the cage. Almost outside. Well, not almost outside the cage, but, like, across the cage. Just really impressive stuff. UFC 7, the first and so far only UFC show to ever take place in the state of New York, which featured Ken Shamrock versus Oleg Tektarov in another super fight. You know, this not that memorable of a show, really. I think this is the one, actually, with Marcos Hujas making his debut. Basically, Hujas was just a guy that actually kind of brought up and promoted, you know, wrestling style. So for anyone that doesn't think wrestling and MMA have anything in common, just look at the early shows. Just look how they're building up guys they just signed. They honestly brought him in, I think, at UFC 6, and like, this is going to be the next guy in a UFC 7. Look out for him. So, you know, just really impressive stuff. This was not an exciting super fight again. But yeah, pretty basic show. I think it's just more interesting to have because it's the only time the UFC's ever had a show in the state of New York. Moving on to maybe my favorite show that I have for sale, and that would be UFC 8 from Puerto Rico, from San Juan, Puerto Rico, where Don the Predator Fry and Gary Goodrich are the stories. Now, they make it to the finals, and this show has maybe my favorite knockout. I have two tapes for sale that have my favorite knockouts. This one, where Gary Goodrich absolutely kills, not Steve, I was going to say Steve Jenham. Paul Herrera is who he kills, who's a Tank Abbott protege. Absolutely just decimates him. So look that up if you must, but why not own the tape where you can own it forever? And Don Fry just basically proves that he's one of the most amazing guys. He, I believe at this point, has this point in time when the show took place, had the fastest knockout in the UFC, knocking out Puerto Rico's own John Ruiz in, like 9 seconds. So really, really impressive stuff. And we didn't see too much of Don Fry. And I think we saw he was at this show, and then the second Ultimate, and that was about it for Fry in the UFC. So really interesting stuff here. This is an awesome show, by the way. Just go out of your way to see it. You know, you'll see how much they've actually grown since 1993. You know, Bruce Beck and Jeff Blatnick are some amazing commentators. They had some great chemistry. I can't remember the name that actually knew a little bit about, you know, the martial arts, but he was a really, really good guy and would eventually go on to do some stuff with King of the Cage. So definitely check these shows out. This is a show that I just personally love, and I think you need to see it. And it's also an interesting show where Tank Abbott threw a chair at someone, and like a brawl broke out in Puerto Rico. So interesting stuff there. Then we get one of the more interesting shows. It's UFC 9, the first UFC show to break away from the whole tournament. Everything was bouts they signed the guys to fight in. It took place in Detroit, Michigan. Had maybe the worst super fight of them all. It was Dan Severn and Ken Shamrock for an hour circling each other. It's a terrible fight. Especially at this point in time, imagine if I know someone on the Wrestling Observer board that said they went to this show, and I can't imagine being in Detroit at that time because this is in 1996, and the Detroit Red Wings just won one of the most amazing overtime games in the Red Wings history over the St. Louis Blues with that Steve Yzerman blast, and then there's this show, and you're just bored out of your mind. It gets that fight gets a "Let's Go Red Wings" chant. So shows how important how much the fans didn't care and just wanted some action. Don Fry, I believe, is also on the show, and he gets a victory in pretty quick fashion. But the fight that's the most interesting for me on UFC 9 is Mark Hall takes on Koji Katao, who is, if you know your wrestling history, was at WrestleMania 7. Was at WrestleMania 7, and in that match with Tenryu against Demolition. So it's just a fight where it's like, wow, this sumo guy may kill him again. And I don't understand why people thought sumo was so great. Yeah, it can push you around, but when the whole point of sumo is just to get you out of a circle. Like Mark Hall just and he just elbows him right in the nose and shatters Katao's nose. So definitely something you may want to see. Really, really interesting stuff. And this is a piece of history because at this point in time, they were getting a lot of heat from the government, and this fight and the heat with the government really hurt the momentum the UFC had. Now we have to skip a bunch of them, and it's UFC 16, Battle in the Bayou. This is a interesting show in the fact that things are starting to look bad for SCG, I should say, UFC under SCG banner. But the shining light on this show is the UFC middleweight championship fight between Frank Shamrock and Igor Zaniev, who honestly, it's 22. It's the first fight I think I ever saw where a man just slammed a guy and the fight was over, and that was it. So that's the shining glimmer of everything. You get Pat Miletich on here as well, but really the whole story, or anything of note in terms of historical fact, is the Frank Shamrock Igor Zaniev fight. So it's really interesting in that aspect. And since we're going to stay with Frank Shamrock, the last tape we have for sale, UFC 22, where only one man can be champion. That's Frank Shamrock versus Tito Ortiz for the UFC Middleweight Championship. One of the greatest fights that the company has ever had. And when UFC was going into UFC 100, I was pissed that this fight was not even on the countdown because it's such an important fight for the company. And first of all, this show is the last show under the SCG banner to be allowed on pay-per-view, as after the show they got cut from all pay-per-views. And it's just an amazing fight, and it really just showed that how strong of wrestling Tito Ortiz had, but also that he was built way too much and he gasses himself out, and Shamrock goes on to get the victory. Just a really, really impressive fight. But it also has Chuck Liddell on here. Jeremy Horn's also on the card. But the most impressive thing for me on this show that you definitely need to see, because you cannot find this on YouTube anymore, trust me, I've looked, is the knockout in the preliminary bout between Brad Kohler and Steve Judson. Just one of the most amazing knockouts ever. And I know Kohler is still fighting today, and if I ever meet him, I'll be like, sir, it's an honor to meet you, because that Judson knockout, oh my lord. So that's really it. That's all the tapes for sale. If you're really interested, I'm going to definitely put these up on eBay and start an auction. But hopefully a lot of you get interested in this stuff and get to learn the history of MMA and not just, watching these shows now and, trying to hope the UFC will teach me history, because let's face it, folks, they're rarely going to teach you much history. You got to go out of your way to do it. And these tapes, it's history through watching. It's like television in the classroom. But really, I rambled way too long about this stuff. But anyway, that's it for me. I'm out. Peace.